Hey, Internet. Hey, YouTube. This is Nate. You can also call me Nathan. Please never call me Nathaniel. And welcome to 5 Builds to Make Seraph Cry, a DLC update. Basically, the thought about this, or my thought about this was, it's been more than a year since I made the original 5 Builds to Make Seraph Cry video guide. And a lot has changed. We had the Friends and Foes patch. We had the Herzl's Workshop patch. We've had the last Divinity DLC. A lot in the game has changed since I made that original video more than 1 year ago. And as we're getting close to the end of this year and just thinking about what would be some fun things to do as kind of like, I'm not going to say my last hurrah with Monster Train, but kind of going into, starting to dive into other games and things like that. I wanted to make this video as a way to update and give my tips on how to make those same 5 builds work with all the changes and all the differences coming into the last Divinity DLC. So there will be timestamps in the video, and the video will be split into 2 parts. Hello, DinoKill, welcome. As I'm live streaming this, and this will be all, like, if you want to see the whole thing all at once in the live stream, you can definitely do it that way. Alternatively, there will be just a separate guide just focusing on the tips and tricks, and there will be separate videos for each one of the runs that we do during this stream. We're going to start off with the first build, which was the Hellhorned build, which is the Angriest Prince build. So if you remember, and if you've seen that video, Angriest Prince, back when the game first started, was easily one of the strongest builds. Let me jump into the logbook, and we'll kind of talk about how it worked back then and how to adapt it to the world today. So basically the idea was you would get Wrathful Prince, and you would get Wrathful 2 with Brawler 1, or you would just get Wrathful 3. And the whole idea of the Wrathful build is you stack lots and lots of armor and rage onto your Prince, and basically he solos most of the enemies with like some help from a backliner. And that's basically the whole build, right? You get this massive Hornbreaker Prince up front doing tons of damage, and has tons of sustain, and he just wins the run by himself. So things have changed a lot since we first started in Monster Train, and there's a couple of huge glaring weaknesses with the Angriest Prince build that we're going to have to try to work around if we want to adapt the build to the modern Monster Train era. So first off, there are a lot more units than there were back in the time of original Monster Train. So what do I mean by that? So in particular, in the Divinity fight, you have floors with like 3, 4, 5 units at a time. They come all the time, and there's a huge problem with trying to kill all of them with just the Prince. The second is the amount of damage that enemies do is now much higher than before, and it's a lot easier for the Prince to get burst out before he has a chance to really scale up and do enough damage. And the third issue is that his rage scaling is slow enough that even if you take damage from an entire floor and somehow survive, you may still not even do enough damage to kill a single unit. So Angriest Prince as a solo build doesn't really work too well, but there are ways to adapt the build. First off, one way, and this is the way we're going to try in the run that we do, is you can go for Awoken and still try to go the standard Angriest Prince spike build. So the way that would work is you basically have to start with Sharpen. You try to get things like Spreading Spores, Cycle of Life, and Bramble Lash. And the whole idea is if you can get enough spikes that you're killing most of the smaller units, that plus the rage, plus the sustain from killing the smaller units should keep the Prince alive to kill most of the floor. And then all you need is someone in the back who can do extra damage to potentially kill the rest of the floor. So that can be something like an Awoken Hollow. That could be a Animus of Will, could be an Animus of Speed, could be a Sweeper, something that will be able to scale damage together with the Prince to make it so that you can kind of burst out the enemies. The other way, and this is honestly not to do with the Prince at all, but just in general, imps are incredibly strong. So you can, of course, just go full fledgling imp and transcend imp, and then all you need is a multi-striking unit in the back. You can still tank with your Prince as long as you have like a welder helper merged with one of your units and has endless. So you can still kind of do that same imp synergies using your Prince as a tank, and then having a backliner who's doing multiple strikes to take out the rest of the floor. Now, that's kind of going away from the idea of the Angriest Prince build, where the Prince just kind of does everything on his own, but that's one of the ways you can adapt it, is just using these imps. With other clans, it's going to be very similar to using just other clan strategies. So if we go, for example, into like Stygian Guard, you can do a lot of like armor synergies. The Prince works quite well with sweepers in the back, so you can get like Cold Celia, you can get your Icy Silophyte, merge one of the sirens onto them, or merge something that's going to help them scale, and then you're playing a bunch of spells on your Prince, buffing him up or attacking the enemies, and then your backliner is scaling with all the spells, and you do a lot of damage that way. Typically with an Angriest Prince build, you don't want to do some of the staple things you would normally see in Stygian. Like, you don't really want Titan Sentry, you don't really want Frostbite, you don't really want Sap with your, with your Lodestone. So some of those things don't work quite as well because they're kind of anti-synergy with the Prince. But otherwise, you can kind of go this Incant style, do a lot of spell damage to make up for the gap in damage from the Prince, and try to keep your Prince alive. If we go into Umbra, you can Gorge with the Prince. It does make it a little bit awkward because the Prince, again, doesn't have multi-strike typically. But yeah, you can Gorge with the Prince. He's usually good with extra health, extra damage. The main advantage of Umbra is going to be the Emberdrain package. Now, we're going to talk about the Emberdrain package as one of the separate builds later on. But absolutely, the Emberdrain package in particular, getting Furnace Tap, is very, very, very good with the Prince. And one thing I did miss, actually going back into Hellhorned as well, is you can take like a One-Horn's Tome, reduce the cost, and put Permafrost on it, and wait until the Prince has some armor stacked up, and then you can get multi-strike via One-Horn's Tome. It does work with the Prince. It's not as good as it was before because it didn't used to have Fragile, but even without Fragile, it's still pretty good. But yeah, so then Umbra, it's really about getting the Emberdrain package and potentially getting some Gorge with the Prince just to make it a little bit stronger, or going a 2-floor setup where you have a Gorge floor and you have your Prince floor. Your Prince helps to take out a lot of the frontliners, and then your Gorge floor cleans up after. Finally, Melting Remnant, I would say is the weakest synergy directly with the Angriest Prince, because most of the things want to like chump block and die and things like that, which doesn't really pair really well when you have a angry Prince that wants to take all the damage. But here you can still make it work. What can be very helpful here is getting things that are going to do a lot of like self-death. So you can put things like the tombs, you can put like Bounty Stalker, things behind the Prince that will die on their own and then do their extinguish triggers onto the enemies and still have the Prince to absorb all the damage and do his attacks to gain extra stats. Also then just going like the standard stuff with Melting Remnant. So drafts onto like Paraffin Enforcers. That's also a good way to scale the Prince even faster if you can get burnout on the Prince with something like Wicklash or Purifying Cleanse. So there are still ways to make Melting Remnant work, but I'd say it's probably the weakest of the setups. And then finally with Wormkin, again, we didn't cover Wormkin because Wormkin didn't exist at the time. But with Wormkin, a lot of the stat improvements are going to go really well with the Prince. Echo Infusion, very, very solid. I like eggs a lot with the Angriest Prince. So you can put these eggs behind the Prince. He blocks all the damage, and then the eggs do a lot of the cleanup. That can work quite well. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, your standard stuff. You want to avoid daze because you do want your Prince to take a lot of damage. Force Contamination can be a great way to deal with bigger units that your Prince struggles to kill. You can use Force Contamination, get some melee weakness, and your Prince can burst them out. Oh, one thing I also missed with Umbra, speaking of, is Trample as well. Trample as well is really, really good on the Angriest Prince. If you can stack him up really high, give him an Umbra Stone, then he will be able to get over those front lines and kill the back line. So I would say if you want to go pure Angriest Prince, your best are going to be Awoken and are going to be Umbra. Awoken due to all of the spike synergies where you can use spikes to kill the backliners. Your Prince grows, gets his armor from killing those backliners during their strikes. And then you have some support with a backliner that's going to do multi-strikes. And then with Umbra, you can try to get the Emberdrain package and Trample, and those can help make up for some of the problems with the Angriest Prince as he is now, which is that he doesn't scale fast enough. And regardless of whatever secondary clan you want, Imps are always going to be really good, especially Fledgling Imp, especially Welder Helper, and especially Transcend Imp. Looking at some of like the core artifacts that are going to be really good with the Prince. Obviously, extra rage is going to be extremely valuable, allowing you to basically double his output. Similar with getting a deranged brute, going to be extremely valuable for your Prince to help scale up that rage much faster, or at least scale up the damage of the rage. You can early game take things like Collection of Tales, which is pretty good to help enable your Prince early. Late game, when you have rage coming a lot faster, it's not quite as good, but early game tends to be really strong. Obviously, because Imps are so good, Impsicle is going to be quite good. Double Summons is going to be quite good. Railhammer is excellent on the Prince because every single trigger is going to get more armor onto the Prince, helping him with the sustain. Outside of some of like the Hellhorned stuff, Emblem of Exiles tends to be really good on the Prince to help him with extra sustain. Gnarled Root, if you're going to go that spike route, helps him to get more damage out of all these spikes that you're putting onto the Prince. Outside of that, I would say, I mean, you have some staple stuff that's pretty good. Fade's First Blade, if you can get burnout on your Prince, increasing the amount of burnout that you get. Both Mark of a Champion and Mark of an Exile are very, very good on the Prince, just helping him get a little bit extra right at the beginning. And then it's just some like core strategies. Some of them haven't changed. So obviously self-inflicted damage is a very good way to scale them. So things like Dark Deal, Torch, not usually Hornbreak, the Branding Right, all of those are still going to be very, very synergistic with the Prince to help him get his rage scaling a lot faster. So that's basically it. So you have to kind of work around his major deficiencies, especially if you're working outside of Awoken and Umbra. You are going to need to support with strong backline units that can clear up a lot of the damage that the Prince can't get or that he can't do on his own. But definitely still feasible. I would say it's not as good as Brawler, but certainly better than Reaper. And with the proper support and building around it, you still can make the Prince work like that. Okay, so we're gonna do a spiked Sentient build. So very similar to the last run. All right, let's go back to the main thing, and we'll start the official. So okay, now on to Awoken. So the Awoken build that I highlighted in the 5 builds to make Seraph cry was the spiked Sentient build. So with Spike Sentient build, the idea is you take Bristling Sentient, you get it to level 3, you get huge spikes, and then you just try to buff up your spikes damage. Also, hello Rexifan. You try to buff up your Sentient spikes and also get all of these typical spike synergies. So you want things like your Shard Channeler, which increases the amount of spikes. You want things like Petrified Crucible, which we just saw in the Angriest Prince run. You want Gnarled Root, and kind of like all these things, right? So this is like the typical setup. And then what you want is a big unit in the back to take care of all of the large units in the front. So things that I like quite a lot, you can get Animus of Speed, Animus of Will. You can get things like Awoken Hollow. You can get not Thorned Hollow. You can get your Sweepers, can also be quite good. You can even take things like Vine Mother and go with stings and kill big things with stings. So yeah, like there's a lot of like really good options, and then of course your secondary clan is going to have a lot of options for killing things. So again, the goal is big Sentient with big spikes. Make sure that it lives. That's very important. Make sure that it lives. Add more spikes as you can. Sustain works quite well. Like spreading spores tends to be really good. And then the ultimate is to get Bramble Lash. So just to be clear, Bramble Lash, normally not incredible, is absolutely devastating if you can get piercing onto it and then make it 0 cost, and then you dupe it a whole bunch of times. You can literally kill every floor with Bramble Lash. So this would be the ultimate. We're going to try to re-roll into Bramble Lash to try to kick this one off. But yeah, this is like the ultimate spell to get, and you can totally make a run work with Bramble Lash. Okay, so that's it for like the Awoken itself. As I said, then you just want to support with healing, with extra spikes, and with spikes increases, right? Some interesting combos. So Hellhorned, typically with Hellhorned, you're going to want to just get things like armor. So armor tends to be quite good. If you can get like an armor imp and rage, you can then have it almost like multi-strike, like spikes and stings and then your rage all together with your imps tends to be really strong. And because the Sentient's only 2 capacity, you can usually buff both the Sentient and a unit behind. So if you get like a sweeper and you have, you know, fledgling imps with welder helpers, then you can get armor, get rage on the whole floor, and they can do extremely well. But yeah, so you're going to want to go for things like the imp synergies. Apex imp tends to be quite good in these builds just because it's easy to scale them up. That kind of thing. Alpha Fiend also not terrible, and his essence is not terrible. Because you're often going to just be able to tank and solo tank with the Sentient, then your Alpha Fiend can just grow, or whatever the Alpha Fiend essence is on can just grow naturally. That tends to be pretty good. So it's about rage, armor, and then, you know, your Sentient doing your Sentient things. Stygian Guard, similar. The one thing you got to watch out for with Stygian Guard, same thing we talked about with the Angriest Prince run. You need to avoid Daze and Sap. Both Daze and Sap are super anti-synergy with your Sentient. But everything else, all of the incants, the sweepers, Guardian Stone is very, very good. You can play a Titan Sentry. Unlike the Angriest Prince build, you can play Titan Sentry and do a 2-floor setup where Titan Sentry softens things up and then your Sentient finishes them off. Any type of incanter is going to do really well because you have restores, which are very easy to play. You make them 0 cost. You restore on your Sentient, and then your, you know, backline Siren or you know, Eel Gorgon or whatever can just get a lot of incants. And then obviously big spells. I mean, what's one of the big drawbacks of of Spike Sentient is your inability to hit frontline units. So then just getting big spells can immediately deal with those frontline units. Moving on to Umbra. With Umbra, you can do the Emberdrain package. You can even do Emberdrain package on the Sentient, although I wouldn't recommend it. Normally what you would want is do the Emberdrain package with something in the back line. Either one of the wills, so Animus of Will, or one of the Animuses, Animus of Will, Animus of Speed, a sweeper. Those are gonna use the Emberdrain package a lot better. So in case you're wondering what the Emberdrain package is, it's Perils of Production, Immortal Trade, Void Binding, and Furnace Tap. Perils of Production is the enabler for all of that, and then your finishers are typically Void Binding and Furnace Tap, which are your huge damage scaling. Gorge is hard unless you have a Morsel made, because you do want your Sentient up front. You also want to avoid Damage Shield, because Damage Shield prevents... Oh, wait, no. Damage Shield is fine on spikes. It's Damage Shield doesn't work on Revenge Trigger. So actually, yes, you can also use Damage Shield. Damage Shield, they still will take spikes damage, even if you have a ton of Damage Shield on your Sentient. So that works quite well. Extra capacity to fill up more units, always going to be a good thing. But then you can Gorge with the Sentient, but it's not particularly great. Normally you'd want another Gorger. Maybe you do a 2-floor setup where you have your Sentient floor that's like healing a bunch and stuff like that. Then you have your Gorge floor on the top that finishes off anything that survives. That can be quite good. But I would say the major parts are Emberdrain package and Damage Shield. With Melting Remnant, you get some unique things. One that's quite good is if you're against Seraph the Chaste and you have Melting Remnant, if your Sentient dies and gets brought back, she will come back with full spikes. So the cleanse only works the one, while the Sentient is alive. If the Sentient dies and you bring her back, she will get full. She'll get full spikes again. That's one of the ways you can play into Seraph the Chaste, even with Bristling. Purifying Cleanse then tends to be pretty good at keeping her alive. And then, of course, all your backline stuff. You can do the similar, like we talked about the Angriest Prince, where you can put bombs in the back line. So you can get like Entombed Explosive, get Burnout onto it in Endless, and play it in the back. And then it hits once, and then it blows up to do more damage to frontliners and things like that. Stealth is very anti-synergy, so don't use Stealth. And then you just want big backliners that can do lots of damage. Wickless Baron tends to be very, very good with Bristling, similar with Big Sludge, because your Sentient will kill off all the backliners, growing your Big Sludge and your Wickless Baron, and then they'll do the big hit and kill the frontliner. So that combo tends to be incredibly strong. I think typically Big Sludge is better because it grows faster. The Wickless Baron can also work with like multi-strike and other things. And then again, avoid Daze, avoid Stealth, because you want enemies to hit your Sentient. And finally, with Wormkin, again, we didn't cover Wormkin last time because it wasn't available. Echo Infusion is just masterful. Very easy way to gain extra health on your Sentient. And outside of that, things that tend to be really good are going to be your Sweeper, Glareminder. Eggs are also okay because Restore is a very, very easy Charged Echo enabler. So you just build up Charged Echoes with Restores, then you have Eggs behind to do cleanup duty. And then your Keeper of Echoes, also very good at getting extra stats onto your Sentient. Cool. Again, looking at artifacts, we talked about some of them already, but Emblem of Exile is always going to be fantastic. I quite like, where is it? Your Thorn Fruit tends to be very good as well, because, again, you can kind of get bursts on any units that survive with those Thorn Fruits. Similar, I actually do like taking the Vine Mother in these builds just to get extra stings, and then obviously your sting synergies are going to be very strong in that case. Root Split Mask, like masterful. You get double spikes on all the units, basically. Similar, Petrified Crucible, which is literally double spikes on all the units. We talked about Gnarled Root to give extra damage to your Sentient. And then all of your typical standard stuff. So, no Blights if you're going against Seraph the Diligent. You don't want Daze. You can do Jack Strips because you don't need to get kills with a Sentient. It's just there to, do kills. And then, within your clans, your typical synergies with those clans. So extra Incants if you're going Incant build, extra Gorges if you're going a Gorge build, extra space is always going to be good with Mind Jacks, that kind of stuff. Cool. So with that, I think we covered basically everything. Oh, I would say one other thing that's also of note that I didn't talk about here. Cycle of Life. Very, very excellent in this build. Again, to get extra HP and to get extra spikes. The way we're going to play this, so again, we'll finish the guide here, and then if you're watching on the guide, we'll next up go into Umbra. And if you're not watching the guide and you're watching the stream, we're going to jump into the run. Next up, we're going to talk about the Ultimate Incant build. So, Ultimate Incant build is probably one of the ones that's more or less untouched from how I describe it in the guide. I think out of the 5, it's really the only one that is completely untouched. The main reason why is that the whole idea of this is to use Conduit, and Conduit is still just the best Tethys. The other two really struggle because, one, they have, all the Tethys have low health totals, and two, because they just don't do enough damage. Frostbite can be okay, but just not like, there's not like a huge amount of damage that are going to come out of these guys. Versus Conduit, which is just such good utility. So how do you do Ultimate Incant build? So, obviously you want Incant units. It's going to be very similar like we just saw. You want your Sirens. You want your Guardian Stones. But here, like the number one is actually to get Lodestone. Lodestone just makes this build completely over the top, and you just win via insane amounts of incanting. Ilgorgon also incredibly strong with this build, and you want to pair it with you can pair it with anything really. I would say Hellhorned's probably the weakest pairing, although you have some pretty good targeted spells like Vent and things like that. But a lot of the other ones are going to be much better. So with Awoken, it goes incredibly well with Root Seeds, because you just get more draw, and more draw equals more spells. Similar, Stings tend to be quite good in these builds. So Stings, the Razor Sharp Edge is quite good because most of your incanters, well not most, but some of your incanters gain health. And so you can kind of like cancel out the Razor Sharp Edge, get the damage, get the incant. Angriest is very good because it draws. Preserve Thorns is very good because it creates draws. Stings are very good because they create draws. Awoken's Rail Spike is incredible. So like Awoken's very, very solid. Probably best or second best out of all the build types. The other one is Wormkin for very similar reasons. A lot of the spells are zero cost, which means you get a lot of like really good zero cost spells to play out on the floor. Your one cost spell, whatever it is going to be really good to help incant as well. The extracts are very, very solid. Echo Infusion is a way to keep Tethys alive. You can get armor out of your where is it? Shelter. So there's a lot of options for like sustain in here. You get the daze on the Divinity, which can help you to keep Tethys alive. So Soul Crushing Guilt. So I think Wormkin's probably the best. Plus, it's really easy to do eggs in a conduit build. You take any damage spells that have infusion, and you just bomb out a bunch of spells, and then your eggs just hatch on their own. So that's probably my favorite setup right now. The other thing that's really good is that eggs are fantastic with incants. So putting any type of incant on eggs means you're going to multiply that effect. And when I say eggs, specifically referring to Kinhost and the Bog Flies. So it's the where are they? The Bog Chrysalis and the Kinhost Vessel. These two eggs are amazing with incant because you get the incant and it's multiplied either by multi-strike or it's multiplied by the number of Bog Flies. That's probably what we're going to end up doing. Final is Melting Remnant. Melting Remnant is also similar to Hellhorned, not particularly... Oh, no, actually, I need to talk Umbra as well. But Melting Remnant, similar to Umbra, is not amazing. Death and bringing back and all that kind of stuff is not particularly synergistic. What is synergistic is you do have some zero-cost spells that can be okay. And Drip Balls are pretty good. Daze, in addition to the other dazes. Some of your incanters maintain their stats through death. Eelgorgon, it actually is pretty good to reform because it will lose the burnout, so there's some synergy there. But otherwise, not particularly great. The spells here are more utility than damage. So the only things that are going to be free are going to be like Subsuming Blade, Mortal Entrapment, Memento Mori. I will say Mortal Entrapment is extremely good in Conduit builds because it's free. So it's very easy to get like the 3 days onto units. But in general, I find Melting Remnant to be quite lacking. Hellhorned to be quite lacking. Umbra, also kind of awkward, but it's actually okay. What is good about Umbra is, again, a lot of zero cost and X costs, which are very easy to play and incant with. Tethys is also not bad to gorge with early on. Late, it's not super great. The Emberdrain package is also fantastic with Incant because you get all of those spells, Perils of Production, triggers, you get a lot of Ember, all that kind of stuff. But I would say it's probably mid-tier. Best being Awoken, Wormkin, then Umbra, and then last being Hellhorned and Melting Remnant, specifically with Conduit. In terms of artifacts, obviously Double Incant's going to be your number one. Outside of that, I really quite like Rules of Containment. Kinstone Totem can be really, really strong with some of your discard mechanics to gain Ember. Totem Fragment, also very good to blast out units. similar with Tethys Scales. Then on top of that, anything that's going to give you extra draw. Split Anvil is quite good to reduce the cost of your spells. One thing to note is that Split Anvil still triggers even if Conduit lowers the cost of the spell. So if you play Conduit with a 3-cost spell, all of your 2 and 1-cost spells will be free. So Split Anvil tends to be extremely good with Conduit because you can get a big nuker and then all of your Root Seeds become free or all of your other 1-cost spells become free. Let's see what else is quite good here. Mark of an Exile can help to keep Tethys alive for 1 turn, but it's not particularly great. Light's Gift tends to be pretty good to keep Tethys alive. Iron Drop Cage, specifically with Siren Song. Very, very good. Oh yeah, Railhammer. If you do have Hellhorned, Railhammer is excellent at just getting more armor out of your units. And then whatever synergizes within the individual clans if you're going in separate clans. Yeah, so we'll start with that. Oh, Thorn Fruit, also very good. Thorn Fruit and Cursed Vines. Anytime you're generating extra spells, tends to be pretty strong. Thorn Fruit a little bit better because you get the extra draw out of the stings as well. Next up is Umbra and the Emberdrain package. So Emberdrain package, still just a dominant strategy in Monster Train. You do need all the pieces to make it work. But the basic idea is you take Penumbra. Normally you go Monstrous. You go Monstrous 3. You can also do Architect here. Both are totally fine. But the idea is you go Monstrous, you get the Trample, and then you buffer it with the full Emberdrain package. So the Emberdrain package is these 4 cards: Immortal Trade, Perils of Production, Void Binding, Furnace Tap. Perils of Production is the enabler and pretty critical to make the Emberdrain package work. It's what gives you the Ember to be able to play your Furnace Taps and your Void Bindings. Best is to get Holdover and Stackstone on Void Binding, to get Stackstone on Furnace Tap, remove Consume on Furnace Tap, and then Spell Chain, Holdover on Perils of Production. Immortal Trade is pretty good early. Late game falls off quite a bit because of the way the interaction works with Multi-Strike. And that's really all you need, honestly. Like, Penumbra by himself will solo anything with the Emberdrain package. If you want to include other stuff in the mix, in particular, if you have Monstrous and you're just not getting Furnace Tap, other Gorge builds can be quite good. So here, then, you would look for things like things to clear backliners. Morsel Maid tends to be pretty good. Alloyed Construct is really good. Your Shadow Eater, pretty good. Overgorger, pretty good. Shadow Siege, if you can play it, if you get sketches, or if you're taking extra capacity anyway to fit your Monstrous Penumbra, then just take, with Emberdrain package, you are getting extra Ember, so Shadow Siege works pretty well. Your other Gorgers, not so good. I wouldn't take any of your Crucibles, your Shrouds, your Morsel Master, Morsel Maker, not typically as good. But they can work, but they're not as good as the rest. If you can get an intrinsic Space Prism or an intrinsic Crucible Extension, then you don't need to take extra capacity and you can go extra draw. Draw tends to be very good, just so you can get to your Emberdrain package cards as quickly as possible. That's all with an Umbra, right? So it's really just get the Emberdrain package and then support it with Perils of Production. If you don't get Perils of Production, some other ways you can generate is with, your X costs. So Mind Collapse, it's tough, but Mind Collapse can generate the Ember that you need. Kindle can also work. You can also just make everything 0 cost, and then you don't have to worry about it. So you make your Lodestone, you Stackstone -2 instead, and then it's free, and you can just play it. You don't have to worry about having your Perils Holdover. That can also work quite well. But then Kindle -2 with Consume removed will generate you 2 Ember every time you play it. So there are other ways, but I would say the standard is just getting Perils with Holdover. And then across any other clan, it's the same. It's the same thing. Any unit that benefits from Multi-Strike and Rage is going to have a good time. Probably the Hellhorned is the best secondary clan because you have Ember generators with important work. You can put like Pyre Chomper Essence onto Shadow Siege to be able to play it. That's really it. It's just that you can generate Ember with important work and with imps, and that tends to work pretty well. Wormkin can also work quite well, just because of what we saw before, where if you get extracts like Carving Karuska, that's another way to generate out of your zero-cost spells. So you then take like Echo Infusions, Echo Transfers, Soul Crushing Guild, Proclamation, and those will actually generate Ember for you. You can also use Forgotten Trade to generate Ember. Last is Melting Remnant, very similar. You can generate Ember with, where is it? Oh, it's a zero cost with your Memories of the Melted. That's usually the biggest problem, is just making sure you have enough Ember. One thing you need to really worry about with the Emberdrain package is Seraph the Diligent. Seraph the Diligent still kind of hard counters, because you typically hold over and spell chain. Then you only have a handful of spells that are your Emberdrain package spells, and if they happen to get consumed, it's really bad. Especially Perils. If Perils gets consumed, it's going to be a really tough time. So that tends to be pretty difficult. But outside of that, most of the time you have pretty straightforward way to victory. In terms of like good artifacts to get, sketches, if you can get any large units, will be really solid, because then you won't have to worry about playing them with Ember, and it'll get them out of the deck. Sinner's Salve is very critical if you are going to go against Diligent, to be able to play them without having to consume or without having to generate with Perils of Production. Hell's Banners tends to be pretty good too if you can get something like zero cost Shade Splitters. You can play a couple Shade Splitters. That will generate Ember for you. Forever Flame, similar, especially if you're going to go like Hellhorned with Imps. Forever Flame tends to be really good. And what else? X costs. I mean, First Health Pact is always going to be good as a way to generate. And then your typical stuff. Mind Jacks also means that you don't have to take extra capacity to fit your Monstrous Penumbra. Chain of Gems pretty good on Monstrous, just to protect him early on. And I think that's basically it. I mean, the build is very straightforward. You take the Emberdrain package and you try to win with it. And then any other clan is just getting units that benefit from all the Emberdrain package, which is like basically any unit can benefit. It's not too complicated here. One of the easier, more straightforward builds. And it still works. You don't really have to change too much about the build. This one's going to be very tricky. So the last build we're going to do is going back to the guide. So last guide, or last build that we talked about in the 5 builds to make Seraph cry guide, was the Burn Bright build. The Burn Bright build, the idea is you go all in on Burn Bright. So you get a big giant Rector Flicker. You put Paraffin Enforcer behind him, and then you scale his damage. The Paraffin Enforcer is getting massive rage and then killing everything. The problem with the Burn Bright build is, one, actually the stats are not incredible. 145, 145, it is good, but you have the added problem of you're only hit one time, unless you get something like the Emberdrain package to give you multi-strikes, or do you get Trample. And 145 health actually isn't enough to like keep him alive forever. However, there is a particular way to play this Burn Bright build that still works. It's a little bit wacky. The way you do it, you have to start with specifically Crushing Demise. So Crushing Demise is an uncommon spell. So you can start with it in the opening of the hand, which is what we're going to do. You Crushing Demise to kill all the units, and you get multiples of them. You get Reform, so Sacred Wicks or Molded, and you Crushing Demise your Burn Bright Rector Flicker, kill the other side, Reform, and you do that over and over again, slowly stacking up the burnout and the stats on your Rector Flicker, and then you play your Rector Flicker on every floor during Relentless. I have no idea how that build does against Divinity. I think you probably need something else that can continue to scale it. But certainly, if you're doing that every single turn, you do that like 8 or 9 times. Like 8 or 9 times is an extra 40-40. Then you have a 180-180. That's pretty good even against Divinity. Might not kill Divinity, but it will kill all the other units, and that's also pretty valuable. So that's what we're going to try. We're going to try to do this. In terms of, because I don't think the standard way is like you just get a massive Burn Bright and you go. And I don't think that that's going to work against Divinity unless you basically rely on everything else. But if you want like a pure Burn Bright build, that seems to be the most obvious way, is Crushing Demise plus Reform to like scale up your Burn Bright to like infinite levels, right? You can also throw in things like Wicklash to get extra damage. You could get a Wicked Blaze instead of a regular Molted or something like that to get more value that way. Currently, the best way to play Rector Flicker is to do Dark Calling because the scaling and the Reform is incredibly valuable. But if we're going to go Burn Bright, that's probably going to be the way we're going to have to do it. In terms of secondary clans, it's going to be anything that's going to be really good in like backliner units. So Sweep, Awoken, Stygian, Sweep is going to be really good. Awoken also has the advantage of all the stat buffs, so we might actually go that way. It's also pretty good to reform a lot of the Stygian units because they have Sweep or Multi-Strike. So I think we'll do Melting Remnant, Awoken to try to get that value. But you could do it here. You could get Rage, and then you just use Crushing Demise to take out the other units while you prep for Relentless combat. Imps also very good with Melting Remnant because you can reform your Imps, play them over and over again to get huge scaling that way. Wormkin would also be good for the sweep. Eggs are also really good to reform, so that could also be a possibility. I think Stygian Guard, not so great. Umbra, not so great in this combo with Burn Bright. But yeah, so I think probably Awoken, Wormkin the best, and then Hellhorned just behind that with Stygian and Umbra in like last place. In terms of relics that you want, the best relic if we're going to do this particular strategy is going to be, where is it? Resin Block, because you get extra stats every time your unit dies and comes back. The other one that's really good is Fade's First Blade, so that during the Relentless combat, he's scaling his own rage over time. Exploding Candle is quite good to do AoE when you kill off your Rector Flicker. Extra Burnout is okay, but better is to just either reform a whole bunch or to scale up Burnout with extra cards. You do not want Votive Key. Do not get Votive Key because this will completely ruin your build. You need to be able to reform and get the stats that way. Other than that, I mean, Mark of a Champion, Mark of Exile, you have a huge basic stats, so that's going to be quite important or quite valuable to you as well. That's basically it. Out of all the other clans, I mean, the Emberdrain package is amazing with it, but we just did an Emberdrain package build, so we're going to avoid relying on the Emberdrain package, because then you're just doing an Emberdrain package build that happens to use Rector Flicker. Also quite good as a unit to put with your Rector Flicker is, well, Legion of Wax can be quite strong if you can get, like, Explosive onto it, but that's kind of its own build anyway. Bounty Stalker obviously going to be very good. So we'll play it by ear, but in general, the goal is you kill off your Rector Flicker over and over again using that spell that I just literally forgot the name of. Crushing Demise. My goodness. Use Crushing Demise plus Reform. That's going to be the strategy. Use Crushing Demise to clear the floors, build up Rector Flicker, play him beat during Relentless. Like, obviously, when I made the guide, it was made at the time that it was meant, but a lot of the same concepts still definitely apply now with all the changes as they did back then. You still need to get enough damage on backliners to kill backliners effectively. You still need to get enough damage to kill big units effectively, and you still need enough sustain to deal with all the Relentless combats. And the core concepts behind each of the builds still make a lot of sense. Like Angriest Prince, you're gaining sustain while, you know, building up damage at the same time. You now just have to adapt to the fact that there's going to be more units you have to kill, and you do that in a variety of ways. We ended up doing it with multi-strike, but I mean, there are other ways to do it as well. We could have done it with a backliner. We could have done it with imps. We ended up going a route that I think was pretty good, but there are still other ways to make the Angriest Prince work. Sentient was definitely the hardest one. Spikes are just in a really rough spot in general. I mean, obviously the Angriest Prince run aside, where we got just insane spikes. The Bramble Lash build, it can work, but it is difficult. You really need to get -2 and holdover to make it really successful. But we still managed to like scrape by and get it to work in the end. Conduit build's not really that different than it is before. Just Conduit's super good. You get a lot of utility. As long as you can keep Tethys alive, like you're going to incant like crazy and probably win. Emberdrain package, still amazing, as it was back when I made the other video. And Burn Bright, also very tricky. I think you have to kind of do this specific setup like I did. Burn Bright as a unit right now is just not good enough unless you have the support of, you know, something to clear the floors, which in this case we use Crushing Demise, but something like that to clear the floors, and then some way to scale up the damage. And that was a mix between the Death and Reform and the extra Rage from the Paraffin Enforcer infused Sweeper. So very, very, as I said, very interesting to kind of like go back to those builds and see how they perform nowadays. Hope this was useful for you. Hope you enjoyed. If you're watching on the stream, my goodness, it's been 4.5 hours. I hope you guys felt like it was worthwhile. And for those that are watching these shortened video clips, if you have not yet, would love for you to subscribe to see more of similar types of content. And as I've mentioned before, we're still trying to do this December goal of hitting 50 subscribers and members. If we do hit that goal, I will be doing an all champions, all Covenant 25 speed run in one stream. So if you want to support financially through a subscription or a membership, there's a reward for everybody in the form of a big video if we can do it. So thanks for all those that have been supporting. Hope you guys are getting something out of these videos and out of these gameplays, and I will see you in the next video. See you later.